In round 7 of the Gashimov Memorial, Magnus Carlsen won a very nice game against Anish Giri. This game was played 2 days ago, and the reason I'm deciding to show this game is because it was such an impressive example of Magnus Carlsen not only playing an opening that he's very familiar with, it's kind of you could call it a calm positional line, but it's a good example of a strong player basically carrying out a plan that doesn't look that dangerous, but has a lot of dangerous ideas behind it. So the burden of proof was put totally on black to demonstrate that white's idea wasn't going to mate or wasn't going to lead to a very strong attack, and Carlsen's idea worked out. So let's jump into the game. Game started off c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6. So we got an English opening that was played numerous times in the Carlsen-Caruana World Championship match, and Giri actually followed in Caruana's footsteps. He played the exact same line. g3, another common line here instead of d5 is to play bishop to b4, but this is, for the most part, the main line nowadays. Bishop g2, bishop c5. This is kind of a newer trend. A lot of the time people used to play knight b6 and play bishop e7, but people thought, well, the bishop is most active on c5, so if I can play that and equalize, then why not? So castles, d3. So essentially white has a very calm plan. It's not so intimidating. It's not, it's nothing explosive. He, for the most part, is planning to play exactly as he does in this game. He later plays knight takes d5, he plays a3, he plays bishop d2 and rook c1. So very simple development of his queen side. So now Anish Giri plays h6, a universally useful move. In some cases he may want to play bishop e6, and that'll be the easiest way for him to develop his c8 bishop without having to worry about knight g5. So knight takes d5, queen takes d5. This is the easiest way for white to develop his queen side. a3. Now white's threatening to play b4 and bishop to b2, so Giri counters that plan with a5. Now Carlsen played bishop to d2, and Giri chose to play queen to e6, kind of getting his queen out of the way, getting his queen off the diagonal of the g2 bishop. Now rook c1 was played. Another common plan for white is to play bishop c3 and follow it up with knight d2 and knight e4, but rook c1 is a perfectly good move. So black has a couple moves here. He can just slide the bishop back to b6 or just play queen e7 as he did in the game, defending the bishop. So queen e7, and now white played bishop c3, and Giri decided to play knight to d4, just trying to essentially occupy the d4 square and potentially play c6 and also trade off a pair of knights. So he solves all the problems in the opening here. Carlsen decided to go for e3, challenging the strong centralized knight. Makes sense. He will almost definitely have to play it sooner or later. So e3, knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3. And now Giri decided to play bishop to d6, and his plan after this can be to simply play c6 and bishop d7 or f5, complete his development, and he'll have no problems at all. So now it's up to Carlsen to set some problems, and that's exactly what he succeeded in doing very nicely. One point I want to mention here is that this is a semi-closed position. There's one half-open file for both sides. White has the half-open C file, black has the half-open D file, and because the position is so closed, white will need to open up the game with pawn play, and there are a couple of different pawn breaks. b4 is a break, d4 is a break, f4 is a break. And Carlsen opted for the f4 pawn break, which is clearly the most dangerous one, as you'll be able to see during the game, in the game continuation. If you play d4, the problem is black can just play the solid c6, and the push in the center doesn't really achieve much. For instance, if you just exchange everything off on e5. For instance, rook f d1, rook e8, take. This position offers no problems for black. So Carlsen went for clearly the most dangerous plan, but the thing I want to point out here is that this was just a case of black playing a sound opening, black having good opening preparation, getting a good position. There was nothing wrong with his opening play, but Carlsen came after him with a pretty good plan that was somewhat dangerous. It wasn't that strong objectively, but that didn't really matter. A lot of the time what you have to do in chess is you have to set problems for your opponent. And sometimes even the smallest problems can be very difficult to cope with at the board. So Carlsen played queen h5, and now he's preparing to play f4. So c6 was played by Giri, like I was mentioning, shoring up the queen side. And now Carlsen went for f4. So the e5 pawn is attacked here. And if black plays e takes f4, g takes f4, white will have an idea of a rook lift with rook f3. So this gets a bit tricky. I thought the simplest way to play this would just be to play the move f5. So not only does this stop white from advancing his pawn forward with f5, but it also defends the e5 pawn, because now f takes e5, bishop takes e5 can be played safely because the queen on h5 would no longer be attacking the e5 pawn. So I thought something like this, just with bishop d7, black can play rook a e8, or just trade on f4 and then go queen f7 and prepare to exchange queens. Black really has no problems here. So he went for e takes f4, which was also objectively okay. He played e takes f4, and Carlsen played the sharpest line. He played g takes f4. Notice one positional point. White has two central pawns versus 0. And he also has a target now along the g-file. This g7 pawn can be a serious focal point to attack. And so basically, one of the main threats now, first of all, there's rook f3 to g3, bringing the rook in to attack along the g-file. Another threat is to play f5. And for instance, I think the best defense here, the simplest defense, is just to play king h7. And then if f5, we counter the f5 push with g6. And then, for instance, if queen h3, we play queen g5, and suddenly, for the first time, black has some real counterplay. So this would have been a good way to play from black's point of view. He decided to play queen takes e3 check, which also was surprisingly sound. But here's the difficult part. So black is up a pawn. White has this very strong attack along the g-file, and he's preparing to set it up very soon. But black needs to decide, what defensive strategy do I want to choose? And the only real defensive strategy that would have worked was something that was pointed out by various engines and by various grandmasters following the game. And the idea was actually to run away with the king, which is a pretty bold and difficult decision to make in a practical game, mainly because it would have required seeing a lot of many moves ahead. So I'll show you the best defense. The best defense is to play f6, and one of the points of this is that the f7 square is now potentially free. For example, bishop e4, queen h3, trying to trade queens. Of course, white does not exchange queens. Queen g6, bishop g4. Now black has further ideas like queen h5 in many cases. Queen h7 check, bishop g6 check, rook ce1 check. So white's bringing all of his pieces into play with check. And this is the tricky part. After queen takes g7 check, it's important to realize that the bishop on d6 is defending the f8 rook. So it's not actually undefended. And in this position, black is threatening to play bishop f3 check, targeting the white king. So actually at this stage, after bishop e4, queen h5, the black king probably looks weaker than it actually is. And at this stage, black has moves, for example, like rook f7 that can be played. And in this position, 5 versus 5, both kings are somewhat exposed. It actually turns out that black has everything defended here. So for instance, if b4, black can just play king to b8. And if bishop to g2, he can play bishop h3, trading off bishops. And in this position, black is actually hanging on and surviving. So this is one of those cases where it was very important to kind of give up on the idea of passively defending key squares and being willing to run away with the king in this critical variation. So f6 was the best move, and the strategy was run away with the king, give up the g7 pawn with check, but you have active pieces and everything is pretty well placed. So in the game, what he played was not sufficient to defend. He played rook to d8, and white just played rook ce1. So white has all of his pieces in the attack. After queen c5, white played f5. Of course, he was not going to exchange off the queens, but now one of the threats is to play bishop takes g7. So black just played bishop f8. passive defense in this game certainly didn't work, and one of the reasons why is because white had much greater concentration of force on that focal point, g7. So white just played bishop to e4 now, and now one of the ideas is rook e2 to g2. Another idea is to play rook f3, which is what he played in the game. Black played rook d5. A nice idea to sacrifice the exchange, but the point is if rook to g1, then he can take the pawn on f5. So the point is that he wants to carry out an exchange sacrifice here, but white does not take it. White just plays rook f3. And now black was essentially out of plans. He has no active ideas. So what white does now is he just plays rook to g1. And look at the g7 point. The g7 focal point becomes overwhelmed. So white essentially is able to have 4 attacking pieces versus only the bishop and king defending the g7 pawn, which clearly is insufficient. So black just tries to bring his worst place piece, his rook on a8, into play, which doesn't really work. Rook g1, rook a7, and here Carlsen played bishop f6. Another idea that would have worked would be to just play rook fg3. I do want to point out that in this position, the move queen takes h6 does not work because black has the rejoinder. Queen takes g1 check, and then suddenly the queen is no longer supported by the rook on f1 pinning the pawn. So it just removes the defender, and then black is able to actually win. So that's the one trick we don't want to fall for. So we don't want to play that blunder. But rook fg3 would have been very strong, and bishop f6 in the game was very strong. He just halts any defensive ideas. f6 will not be playable. So black tried g6 in the game. He was essentially out of ideas. White was going to play rook f to g3. So white actually could have sacrificed the rook here. Take, 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 and if rook g7, he can just play take. And if bishop takes g7, the idea for white is just to play f5, or f6, f5, f6. So after bishop takes g7, f6, there's no way to defend there. So rook takes g6 check would have won. Carlsen decided to play in a risk-free manner, and I want to point out that after queen h3, rook to d6 was played, okay, attacking the bishop on f6. Here white could have played d4. This would have been a really nice move. Here's the point. Rook takes d4. If f takes g6, white is sacrificing his queen, but he's going to win it back with a discovered attack, well, a discovered check. So after bishop takes h3, g takes f7, king takes f7, bishop takes d4 is check, and the queen on c5 drops off. So that would have been a really nice discovered attack. But Carlsen kept it all under control. He didn't take any risks, and he didn't really actually have to calculate that much. He just defended his bishop, and now the g6 pawn is facing a serious threat. So black sacrificed the exchange, and after bishop e7, white was just able to pick off this pawn on c6. So white just went into this endgame where he's up the exchange, and he won it rather easily. If g5, there's f6, and in the game king g7 was played, and white just played take, take, and d4, and just basically advanced his pawn up. After a4 was played, black couldn't really find a plan. White just played d5, so white has a strong pass d-pawn. He has pressure against g6. The rooks are both active. His king is safe on the long diagonal because the bishop on c6 anchors everything and defends everything, so there's not much for black to actually do here. So he could try something like bishop d6, bishop e8, and then after rook gf1, something like bishop takes b5. So in that position, white is not only up the exchange, but he's also up a pawn. So Giri played b4, and then bishop e8 was played, and after bishop g5, trying to block g6, white just played h4. So he's going to win the g6 pawn anyway. After bishop takes h4, rook takes g6 check was played, king h7, and then after rook c6, attacking the undefended bishop on c8. There wasn't really a good place for it to go, so after bishop g4, white just played rook f4, attacking the two undefended bishops on g4 and h4. Rook g7 was played, and black just resigned. White can just play bishop g6 check and take the bishop on g4 after that, and again, white is up the exchange and a pawn with a pass pawn to soon be created on the queen side. So this was a very nice example of why Carlsen is still the highest rated player in the world. He put his opponent under tremendous pressure and set difficult problems for him, and Giri had a really tough fundamental decision to make. Should I try to defend passively, or should I try to run out of the war zone? Should I try to run away from the danger zone? And for many players, it would be a very bold decision to decide to get up and run away with the king, especially facing that kind of attack. It might look like you're going to lose another pawn or a third pawn even, but it turns out that it's only material equality there, and black would have actually been fine. So Carlsen set problems for his opponent. They were too much for Giri to cope with, and Carlsen won a great game.